how many people were killed in that wreck, and I barely had a scratch. I had a scratch where the airbag scraped my arm.
Where was it?
I had a rear ender on 526.
Don Holt.
Yeah, just before the Don Holt Bridge. People were pulling off on the what's the name of the street there? Anyway, they were pulling off, and they backed out into the interstate because there were so many people in that line. And there were 3 or 4 cars in the right lane, and that's where I was. And they were stopped, just stopped right in the middle of the lane. And I didn't see this. There was a big white van in front of me, and it was 5 o'clock, and traffic was just thick as it could be. So all of a sudden, the white van, he was coming up on that stopped car, and he saw an opening, and he took it. And that left me as close as I ended up, doing 50 miles an hour in a stopped car right in front of me. And I hit him, boy, I said,
you're going to hit
some, and rammed him. Hardly scratched his car at all, totally mine.
What, 7, 8 years ago? I mean, it was a
long
time ago.
I don't know.
I was doing the children's messages at the church because I talked about it. So
anyway, I called Sam to tell him about it, and he was there right away. And that helped because he didn't charge me for the accident. And he could have hit me with following too close. Although I'm thinking this guy's, the minimum is 40, and he's doing 0 in my lane. You know, how could that be my fault for following too close? But I couldn't move because there was just traffic like crazy. Anyway, I got a few scratches, but walked away. And the cop thought, when he saw it, he told me, he said, my only question was how many people were killed in that car. Wasn't me. I was looking out for me that day.
Good.
Okay.
all right. Whenever people look at the world events, I'm sure you've seen this, Pash. People look at what's going on in the world today, and they're like, when is Jesus coming back? Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the time when Jesus is going to come back. And whenever anybody asks me that question, what's my response? You guys know what my response is.
Well, it's his time.
No, has the third temple been rebuilt yet?
Nope.
Because a lot of the prophecies circulate around that. And if the answer is...
construction.
They're thinking about it. But if the answer to that is no, then my response is no, it's not time yet. And they're like, well, how do you know? I said, well, not that no man may know the time, but I do know that the third temple is very pivotal in all of those prophecies. And God has not been wrong in any of those prophecies since. So it's got to be here. And the absence of the temple tells me that it's not time yet. There have been a lot of things in the Bible that circle around the Jewish temple. There have been 2 of them. And a third will be built someday. How do I know that one will be built someday? Because he don't lie. The prophets that God gave insight into the future events were very concerned about Israel, specifically the temple. And so they did focus a lot on what was going on at the temple at the time. It was very important to them. And the reason was because, think about it, most of the prophets were going through a time when the temple was either being destroyed or being rebuilt. And so they seemed to be very, very concerned about the goings-on of the temple at the time of Jesus' return. So whenever they talk about it, they always go back to whatever is going on at the temple. That's how I know that there's going to be a temple, because they were very, very attentive to it. Now, up to this lesson, God has been with the Hebrew people in an ark, which, as we've discussed, is just basically a wooden box with golden overlay. And that was housed in a tent most of the time. Sometimes it was a house in someone's garage while they were waiting, to move it to Jerusalem. But that's only if someone touches it and dies, and then they put it in someone's garage. But look at it this way: the ceremonial cleansing of the people, the sacrificing, the offerings, all of those were beginning to lose their centrality in society because, as we talked about before with Solomon, they were going to different high places and doing things, and they were getting different ways of worshiping. Now, the problem with that is that whenever you separate from the codified rules, so to speak, you start to develop your own sort of rules. Well, it's okay. You don't have to do it that often. You don't have to wear this. You don't have to sacrifice that. You can do a blemished sheep. It doesn't matter. Whatever you can give is fine. Whatever you want to do. You don't even have to come to church if you don't want to. You see what I'm saying? It is the farther you get away from the rules, and you've got a list of them right there in front of you. Once you get away from what's in that book, it gets very, very tempting as far as humanity goes to go on the lazy side. Now, God is very specific, and he's going to get into that today, about what his expectations are for humans and him to be able to have a relationship. Very simple. It's 3 sentences, and he repeats it over and over and over again. But anyway, but the point is that if you get away from someone telling you what the rules are, you're going to make up your own as you go. And that was the problem. The high places were starting to turn into worshiping Baal and Asheroth or whatever you wanted.
Virgin Mary.
Yeah, or whatever you wanted. And God was actually being augmented with Baal worship. All of a sudden, God became Baal's father, or Baal became God's father in certain thinking, in these upper areas. And so as a result, it gets confusing, because if you've heard one thing in one town, you go to visit another town, they've got a totally different thing. Well, who's right and who's wrong? That's the problem, is when you get all these different interpretations or different ways of doing things, it gets convoluted. So as a result, a temple needed to be built. Now, this was not to house God. Let's be very specific about that. God does not live in this dimension. I mean, he can come and go as he pleases. He's extra dimensional. He created it. He's not constrained to a box. He's not constrained to a house. Okay.
He is, in fact, everywhere at the same time.
All of these items that they supposedly put God in, the ark or the tabernacle or the temple, were for our benefit. It had nothing to do with what God needed. God does not need a house. In fact, he told David, if I ever asked you for a house, I don't need a house. But what was happening was society needed a focus point. God needed to give them something, because we're very, very superficial beings. We need to see, touch, feel something. And God requires 100% faith. And we talked this morning about how we've had experiences with him, and we know that he hears us. We know that he acts. But if you talk to anybody else who doesn't have that book in front of you, they're like, well, that was just lucky. You see what I'm saying? So we, as a society, as human beings, we need something that we can focus on. And so that's why he built the temple. It was not to replace God. It was not to house God. It was to give people a central point to where they can do the right thing rather than doing the individual things that were going on throughout society. Now, yesterday, there was an article published on how the United Methodist Church may have to split over the issue of gay marriage. Some say that it's an abomination and cannot be condoned by the church. Others say that society has shifted, and so should the church. Because if you refuse to be accepting, then you run the risk of losing congregations. And that's the whole point, isn't it? The bottom dollar. You lose people, you can't get money, you can't do anything. So you need more people, so you have to dilute it a bit to be more socially acceptable. Things like this, what happened yesterday in that article, things like that are not new, even though we seem to think that they are. When I mentioned it to you this morning, you're like, yeah, that's a horrible thing. But this has been going on for centuries, millennia. This is not anything new. Things like this have been happening throughout all the societies that have been exposed to God or not exposed to God. God needed to pull the people back to him, and he does today too. His solution around 3,000 years ago was to allow a temple to be built to give the people something to focus their gaze back towards him. Have you noticed all the attacks of Christians in this last year? Haven't you said, Pastor, that more attacks have been done against Christians than any other?
Every year it increases.
Have you noticed the attacks on the Jews that happened within this last month? Every day of Hanukkah, there was some massive killing. That stabbing is the most brutal one with a machete. By the way, did you see the pictures? They posted pictures of him in his hospital. It's gruesome. Something needs to bring our focus back to God. And I feel that a revival is on the way. I'm very hopeful that a revival is on the way. As the Jews are looking forward to a third temple, being able to focus and bring people back. And we learned during our study of Revelation, remember when Leah Watley came in here, she talked about the preparations that are undergoing right now. They're actually practicing how to sacrifice. They're getting the sacrificial elements lined up.
They're still going to sacrifice lambs and sheep.
Of course, it's required. That's what it is.
That's why it's in the Old Testament. They don't use it.
Do you think that they should augment to society's changes?
New Testament was a new covenant.
In fact, now in Revelation, it says that there's going to be a 7-year peace treaty, and halfway through the 7-year peace treaty, the people are going to be outraged that they're still offering sacrifices in the temple. So that's going to be a part of Revelation, and it makes sense to me because, like you just said, they're still going to do sacrifices there.
Well, if they accepted Jesus, they wouldn't, because the new covenant said that he was a sacrifice.
But they haven't
Yeah, they
in
haven't.
Judaism, and so that.
But they're just wrong. See, all this is for naught.
But it has to happen for Jesus to return. I'm telling you, all of this has its place. Anyway, so oh, and also remember, she was talking. Not only are they getting the things to collect the blood and all of that sort of stuff, that making the implements, but they're also focusing most of their advertisements for the third temple at the young population, because if you get the young people involved in it, that can go forward. Now, some stats on Solomon's temple. He begins construction on it 4 years into his reign. It takes 7 years to build. And after the destruction of this temple, replacing it is going to take 7 times 7 years, 49. The first temple period, this is when this temple is in existence, takes place in what we commonly call the Iron Age. Just to put it in context. When you're talking about the Iron Age, it's when this temple was built. Because a lot of people will talk about in the Iron Age in China or the Iron Age in Europe. You got to understand, in Iron Age, this is when the temple, Solomon's temple, is still standing. Scientists estimated that the cost of Solomon's temple was a mere $30 million. However, with our cost analysis of the donations, last lesson, remember we were talking about how much gold they got. It cost over $10 billion worth of gold alone. And just to put it in context, that, here, look at that.
That $10 billion?
No, that's $140 of gold right there. That little bit. No, you got to pass that around. But the temple wasn't built with gold.
What?
It was decorated and overlaid with gold. The actual structure itself was stone and timber. It was decorated on the outside. And we know that David tried to procure the materials necessary for his son Solomon to do the job prior to his death and handing the kingdom over to him. Now, if it was strictly a David thing, the plans...
couldn't count.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if it was strictly a David thing, the plans, the pledges, the material would have evaporated upon David's death, because what's the point? This is stuff that we swore to David that has no bearing on us. However, if God is behind it, it'll go past that. So let's see. Dad, if you wouldn't mind, 1 Kings 5, verses 1 through 12.
When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. Quote, "You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord, his God, until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, a quote, end a quote, your son whom I will put on the throne in your place will build the temple for my name. End quote. So, give orders that the cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians." When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, "Praise be to the Lord today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over his great nation." So Hiram sent word to Solomon, "I have received the message you sent me, and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away, and you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household." In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs he wanted. And Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom, just as he had promised him. There were peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty.
All right. Tyre is an ancient Phoenician city-state. They had several different cities that monopolized, but there was Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians were the early traders, the Ferengi of the ancient world, if you want to look at it. Now,
that only means something to me.
what would it be nowadays if you were to think about it? Who were the great traders, businessmen of their age? But I also want to point out to you that Tyre is also, since we mentioned the Revelation and all that stuff, Tyre is mentioned in Revelation. So it goes back. Now, they were a northern neighbor of Israel, and they were a little coastal city. And this is them. That's north, and that is the Egyptian port and the Sidonian port. So they had two big ports on it. It's like a Charleston Harbor if Charleston was an island. And that right there is the mainland. Okay, so this is this is the Mediterranean, and they actually had trading vessels that went all the way to Britain to bring tin. That's why Britain gets its name, the place of tin, Britannia. And so they found it. And they thought it was like a secret weapon to make tin. It was something that hadn't been experienced before. Remember, tin, the Iron Age. This is during that time frame. So they were really big in trading to Egypt, Greece, Spain, Britain, all over the Mediterranean. These are the guys that traded everything. Now they didn't have much of a military, all right, but they did have a lot of ships and shipping. Cedar, Mom, you tell me this. What is the advantage of having a cedar chest?
It smells great for one thing, but it also protects from bugs. Any bugs that get into a cedar chest that kills them automatically. So
Cedar has a natural defense against pests, mold, fungus. I mean, all of it. I mean, so it is ideal for preserving things. But it is also, the Hebrew word for cedar translates also into strength or strong. And so it is a very strong wood. It's not, and I was talking to Marty this morning as we were driving here. I was thinking, think about how God puts certain plants where we need them. Think about Fort Moultrie and the palmetto logs. A cedar would have splintered under those circumstances, but the cannonball just bounced off. Or absorbed them and didn't destroy the fort. But anyway, so they need cedar for the infrastructure, the superstructure of the temple.
Built to last.
Yes, built to last. It doesn't require replacement very often because nothing really attacks it.
No
Mold, mildew can't touch it, and pests don't burrow into it. So it's not one of these things that termites are going to be a problem with cedar. It's not going to be a problem. Now, Solomon was granted wisdom from God and wrote extensively, and we learned this, wrote extensively on animals and plants. So he knows how important cedar is and all that stuff.
And you always hear about cedars from Lebanon. Is that the only place they grew?
Listen to this.
Coming up.
Present-day Lebanon, cedar is a protected species due to its reduced numbers.
Really?
The term used by historians is that the temple project used massive amounts of cedar. So I submit to you that the temple construction helped cedar become a protected species in Lebanon today. I mean, they built ships, but ships can be built out of anything, pine, maple, whatever. But cedar was very, very specific for actual construction of massive buildings that needed little maintenance. You don't want to have to tear down a wall and rebuild it. And so as a result, I think that the cedar that was used from Lebanon, which is right next door, Lebanon is right there. The coastline that you're seeing right there is Lebanon. And Lebanon is a northern neighbor of Israel to this day anyway. But anyway, the point is that I think that because if you think of Israel, you don't think of trees. You've been to Israel, Patrick. I mean, is it a thick forested area, or is it?
I didn't see it.
And the same thing with Lebanon nowadays. Cedar was highly sought after in the ancient world, but apparently for this, they got all of their cedar from Lebanon, and it's a protected species to this very day. Also, how are they going to transport the logs?
Float them down the river.
Float them down. Same thing that any Mediterranean shipping company would do. You put it out there and float it down. One of my favorite things to watch is like a Dirty Jobs episode where they find these sunken logs these sunken logs that they used to use when they, in our day, when they were lumber jacking, they would cut the trees and they would float them down the river and get log jams, because they.
Yeah.
But anyway, so some of these logs would fill up with water and sink, and they're perfectly preserved on the bottom mud down there. Once again, in the cold water, they're preserved, and so they would bring them back to the surface, and you can't find wood like that
This is
nowadays.
what you just recently.
Yes,
The
yes.
what?
You can't find.
What did he say?
He said that that's just in the news recently.
Oh.
And so what they would do is that instead of actually using the log, they would make veneer out of it and use it because it's so highly decorative and so well preserved. But anyway, so using logs and waterways is a common practice. And that's how the ancient Phoenicians conducted trade. Now, what did they get in exchange? Now, you mentioned a whole bunch of weights and measures we don't understand here. You talk about baths of
Food.
oil and cores of wheat. Well, how much is that? Well, I've done the math.
Okay.
I've done the math.
Oh, something you did.
Yeah, 20,000 cores of wheat annually. Now, this is every year, right? So how much does that translate into? It's 12,960 pounds of wheat. And I'm not, that's, what was that? I don't even want to think about how many tons that is. 20,000 baths of olive oil. That's 21,600 pounds of oil. That's a lot of jugs of
They
oil.
produce all this in Israel?
Yes. Remember, I told you. Remember, last time we talked about Israel. It's very successful. I mean, make
It is
Israel great
different,
again.
It's different than any country in the world.
But make Israel great again. Remember, we talked about the joked
Yeah.
about that. They were very, very successful. They had all this extra wheat and all this extra produce and all that. That so much so that they couldn't devour it all, and they traded it all. So that's what this guy wants. So yeah, that's a lot. By comparison, the U.S. produces 2.3 billion bushels of wheat per year, or 1.8 billion pounds.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. So that takes care of the supplies.
Amber waves of green.
Yes, that takes care of the supplies, and it also takes care of the payment. But as anybody knows, with an automobile repair shop, it isn't the parts that is the costliest.
Label.
It's the labor. So let's get into that. Sweetheart, if you wouldn't mind reading 1 Kings 5, 13 through 18.
King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Biblios cut and prepared the timber and the stone for the building of the temple.
Okay, so let's do a little bit of math here. 30,000 men to deforest Tyre, 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stone cutters, and 3,300 foremen.
For foreman, you got that many
Supervisor.
foremen, each one of those has to account for what, 20 or 30 men, at least.
Just using these numbers, that's a Jewish labor force of 186,300 men. To put that in perspective, Goose Creek has a population of only 40,500. North Charleston has a population of 97,500. Somerville has a population of 47,900, meaning that this labor force was the combined entire populations of North Charleston, Somerville, and Goose Creek. And then I did some more research. Berkeley County, this whole area right here that you're seeing, all the way from King Hoy, and we are included in this because we are in
Yeah,
Berkeley
we're in
County.
Illinois.
All the way up to Simpsonville and Honey Hill, all the way up to St. Stephen's, and all around Lake Moultrie, Bono, Cross, Sandridge, Sangaree, Moncks Corner, all of Mount Holly, all of that. Berkeley County population, men, women, and children, 221,091. So that means that Berkeley County is just a little bit bigger. And if you take all the women and children out, I'm willing to bet you the Moncks Corner doesn't even have as many able-bodied men as this Jewish labor force was.
Take away the women. You get able.
At least half. At least
Yeah.
half. Now, the stone. Let's talk about that real quick. The stone was cut at a quarry and carried to Jerusalem, so there was no cutting on site. So they actually cut and measured and did everything right over there, and then
You
carried
said
it
he had
over.
the colors in the hills? What is that?
Oh, I'm going to show you that right now.
I keep leading you on.
I know, it's okay. This is where the stones have been removed from. This is called Zedekiah's Quarry, and you can see the cut etchings in the ceiling. This is an underground quarry. Nowadays we
Dangerous.
have quarries where you can see them from the sky. You know, they cut down into these little. Oh, by the way, did you see that Sullivan's Island? Oh, you didn't see this in the news. They were having a big problem with parking. Can you believe that?
No. So,
It's not like we didn't see that happening years ago and offered them a solution for it, and they turned us down.
turn it down.
But anyway, so in that hill that they filled up, remember it had those conics down. Quarries look like that. You know, they cut down to a point, and then they go on to another one. This is all underground, in the dark.
That's true.
In the dark. And they got to measure precisely, get it cut to exactly the right specifications, and then have it towed off there. Can you imagine the problems involved in that, the skill that's required for that? And all this is done in 7 years.
Aliens. That's the answer. Aliens.
These quarries are underground, and the stone that's used is limestone.
That's
And,
easier to cut, isn't it? Limestone.
It's not limestone's easier to cut, yeah, definitely easier than marble. And it also is good structure. You know,
But it's not. Is it stable? I mean, it's.
well, remember this is just the foundation of it. It's the covering. The covering is going to be the gold and the cedar and all that stuff. This is the foundation for it, so it's not a lot of weathering per se. Anyway, large blocks of high-grade stone. I can only imagine how much they weighed. I couldn't find anybody that would give me any specifications on that. When Herod facelifted the temple, just 17 years before Jesus' birth, he was trying to. This is the second temple, not the first one, but the second temple. He was trying to help it up. He used stones from the same quarry. In fact, the Wailing Wall that you see nowadays is built from limestone that was taken out of this quarry. So, let's build. Mom, 1 Kings 6, verse 1.
It's one word.
Okay.
Can you handle it?
In the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zeb, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord.
This one verse caused me so much problems because there's a lot of controversy in the historical community as to what this means versus adding up the dates and all that stuff. Because if you do all the adding and subtracting of the year of the judges and the 40 years in the wandering and you know when they came in and all the conquering and you know all the stuff we've been talking about from escaping Egypt to today, a lot of scholars have added them all up and says that that's 573 years. But as you see in the very first couple of words in this one verse, it says in the 480th year after they came out. So I went through and I looked and I looked and I looked, and this took me forever this morning. I'm not going to get this finished for this one stinking verse, but let me just reduce it for you, let you know that the Bible's correct. It was 480 years. All right, the people who were doing this weren't carrying the one, or they weren't or they were adding something that they shouldn't have done. They were taking the year of the judges, but they were also putting Samson in there as well, but not letting it, converge on those years.
Add them together.
Exactly, they're stacking them instead of realizing that there's a blending. And we've covered that before when we were talking about the Bible before. This guy lived for this line, and and so on.
I remember you doing it.
And in fact, Samson and I can't remember who it was, but one of the prophets probably knew each other because one was still living at the same time. So, but what they did was they just added on. They're lazy. They didn't go back and actually look at lifespans. But anyway, so it was 480 years, and which I'm grateful that the Bible's correct.
Yeah.
And it places the groundbreaking ceremony for the temple to be October of 956 BC.
Second month is October.
Well, because they start their months in August, September. You got to understand that September 11th.
Jewish calendar.
Remember, that was the end of the Shemitah year. Remember, I talked about that when we talked about Shemitah, the collapse of the stock market in 2008. But anyway, so it always is in August, September, depending upon where the moon is, because they go on a lunar cycle, not a Gregorian calendar like what we've got. So it does get complicated to try to figure it out. But yeah, it's in October of 956. It was completed in the fall of 949 and dedicated in 948 BC. So once again, that verse took me forever. So now that we know when and with what, let's look at the size of the structure. Pastor, can you read verses 2 through 6?
That's the 6th chapter.
Yes.
I brought my amplified along this morning, so it's a little bit different.
Okay.
I'll be reformed.
The length of the house Solomon built for the Lord was 68 cubits, its breadth 20, and its height 30 cubits. The length of the vestibule in front of the temple was 20 cubits, equal to the width of the house, and its depth in front of the house was 10 cubits.
Is that through 6?
So, okay. For the house he made narrow lattice windows. Against the wall of the house he built chambers running round the wall of the house, both of the holy place and the holy of holies, and he made the side chambers all around. The first story's side chambers were 5 cubits wide, those of the middle story 6 cubits wide, and of the third story 7 cubits wide. For around the outside of the wall of the house he made offset in order that the supporting beams should not be thrust into the walls of the house.
All right. So, what's a cubit? What's a cubit?
15 inches.
A cubit is, do everyone know what a cubit is? You can measure it yourself. It's from the tip of your middle finger to the tip of your elbow. That's a cubit. The problem is that not everybody's forearm is the exact same length. Not everybody's middle finger is the same length.
Not everybody's middle finger is longer than the second finger either.
But doesn't the dictionary say it's 18 inches?
Yes, it can vary anywhere from 17 and a half to 20 inches in length. And so 18 seems just as good as a rounding as anybody else. But once again, this puts it in a very human measurement term. You know, God's building is built with human measurements. The physicality of, and this also probably allowed the stonecutters to do a good job because they had their own measuring instruments there. That you got your own hand. I know it gets complicated. How many stonecutters? You can't cut because your finger's too short. You can't cut because your arm's too long. You got to find someone exactly.
Everybody line up and hold out your middle finger.
Yeah. Anyway.
They had one guy that walked around over here. I need a measurement.
And it even gets more complicated because the Romans then adopted the cubit and made it 24 inches. So, but anyway, for our measurement purposes, I'll put it this way: the Holy Temple was approximately 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. So that puts it as a 2,700 square foot size building. Now, Dad, you dealt with real estate. 2,700 square foot, one story.
That isn't real big. I mean, that's large, but
That's the footprint. That's the footprint of the actual building. Now, that's not the whole thing. That's not
this
the
is
whole.
almost 2,000.
This one right here.
1,950.
And this is a one story, so that's about right. But if you were to take this and the pool and probably the backyard, would that probably be about the size of the building?
Yeah,
More
I
or less.
don't know. I haven't.
But you see what I'm saying, though?
Yeah.
I think that we can sort of get an idea of it. It's bigger than this house, but not by very much. We were trying to figure it out this morning. It's almost about twice the size of my square footage, but I've got 2 stories.
Yeah.
Now, also, not only are we talking about the footprint of this building, but it was 4.5 stories tall.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the description right here.
Yeah.
Now, what we're talking about as far as the main building, we got to make sure we talk about it. We're talking about this area right here, this square, right? These are those side rooms that you were talking about. You had 5 cubits here. So those are added on, and the entire complex, the gated in area, was 180 feet in length and distance. So it also turns out that these dimensions, which were divinely given to David, correspond almost to the right size as the tabernacle was, as far as how big each one of those little garmented rooms was.
In baseball terms, which is the way I think a lot, 90 feet is the distance between the bases.
Mm-hmm.
From home plate to first base is 90 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that a man can run in about 5 seconds.
So that's how long it is.
That's how long it is. Now, 30 feet
30 feet wide. That's a third of the distance.
Yeah.
That's a pickle play. That's a pickle play.
That's about half of the mound's distance from home plate.
Well, once again, you know, not all of us have our baseball.
Anybody has seen a baseball field, I feel like I can give you some sort of recognition.
By the way, did you see that they're going to be netting in all of the baseball, you know, all the way around so nobody gets hit?
That's a good idea.
Anyway, so that's just the building. That's not the entire complex, the 2,700 square feet. Sweetheart, could you read verses 7 through 10?
In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. The entrance to the lowest floor was on the south side of the temple. A stairway led up to the middle level, and from there to the third. So he built the temple and completed it, roofing it with beams and cedar planks. And he built the side rooms all along the temple. The height of each was 5 cubits, and they were attached to the temple by beams of cedar.
It's your household to 10. Yeah,
Now they took Lebanon cedar trees and they had to make planks out of them. They had to saw those things to make planks, right?
Mm-hmm.
What sort of saw did they have back then? Was that? I mean, how did they cut?
Electricity hadn't been invented.
No,
back then.
yeah. Well, once again, or any iron tool. So this is chipping and all that stuff. Yeah, and the no buzz saws obviously back in those days. But all that stuff was taken care of off-site, you see. So when all they had to do when they came to Jerusalem was assemble. There wasn't any construction, no noise.
Like Christmas Eve.
Sort of. Everything's. By the way, to put it in perspective, each room was 7.5 feet tall. So
We figured this was 10, right?
no, mine is 10.
This one's 12, isn't it?
No, we only were able to have a 7-foot tree, right? Because ours is 8 foot.
You and I measured it one time. This is 10. I always thought it was.
So you've seen the ceiling in my house in that main room. That's about the height of what these rooms
So
are.
8 feet is a sheet of paneling or.
So these are rooms that you can stand in and be comfortable with. I mean, it's not like you had to crouch down.
And it was smaller then.
Yeah, well, that's true. But once again, what I'm saying is that this isn't like that you had to crouch down in every room. It was sort of spacious for these side rooms on the side here.
Well, 8 feet is standard for construction. That's sheetrock.
I need to point out that the temple was constructed where the angel was held up by God saying, "Stop." Remember when the plague was going through and David had said, "I'll deal with you for 3 days," and it was just wiping them out. And all of a sudden he said, "Stop." And David actually saw him with the fiery sword in his hand getting ready to come down. And that's the threshing floor that he bought. Also, the temple was built on Mount Moriah, right, which is also the same place where Abraham took his son Isaac to offer a sacrifice, and Isaac said, "What are we going to sacrifice?" It's like God will provide something. Tied him up, and then all of a sudden God provided the ram. But anyway, so that's another thing where God said, "Stop." So all this stuff, the temple being constructed on points where God always tells people to stop doing something. I think that's sort of interesting. It's one of those curiosities of history that the temple was put at a place for the people to stop misbehaving, to stop caring about and doing their own religion, to stop bending to social norms, to stop doing what everybody else is doing. That's what the temple was for. It was a place for people to stop. And because God had called out and shouted "stop" multiple times at that location. Have you ever noticed that phone numbers are repeated in commercials like at least 3 or 4 times? You notice that? 555-6646, 555-6646, and you're like, okay, and then they do it a third time. Why do they do that? You took college, you know why they do this.
Yeah, repetition is the best way to somebody hear something.
The human brain remembers things in chunks of 3s, typically.
Oh, really?
Notice the Social Security number: 3 numbers, 2 numbers, 4 numbers, but a 3-set digit. You can't remember
Telephone numbers.
Exactly the same thing. Area code: 3 numbers, and 4 numbers. All right, so that we as human beings we do things in sets of 3s really easy. Now, God is aware of this. He built us. He understands how our minds work. Right. So now, sweetheart, can you read verses 11 through 13?
The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep my commandments and my commands, and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people of Israel.
How many times has God mentioned this to Solomon?
About doing my will?
Yes. At least 3 times now that I can recall. Right? Why? Why does he feel like this is so important? And the reason is because this is a central tenet as how God expects us to behave. Look at what he says here. Follow my decrees, observe my laws, keep my commands, and obey my commands. And what's the payoff if you do all this things? I will not abandon you.
Yeah.
I will not abandon you. He hasn't changed. And by the way, this is not the only person. Solomon's not the only person he's told this to. He told this to Joshua as they were heading in. He said, if you obey, remember that when he was going in, he said, listen, you've got to obey these things. Moses, he told Moses, all the leaders, all the judges, he tells them the exact same thing. He has not changed this dialogue for all of these centuries that we've been talking about. Every time that someone gets in a leadership position, he says this. This should be up there right next to John 3:16. These verses.
Yeah.
Because John 3:16 happens once in the Bible. This set of list of orders and requirements of what God expects from us and the payoff, I won't abandon you. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, turn from their wicked ways, and call on me, then I will heal their land. It's the same thing. So God hasn't changed. God has not changed. And all of these, and that's why I think this needs to be up there with John 3:16, 10 Commandments, all of this. This is how God, this is the if-then-else statement of God and how he wants to interact with people.
It's amazing the promises that God has made to the Jewish people. But yet there are more atheists among the Jews than any other race in the world.
Capital, yeah.
But this is what makes what the Methodists are doing so horrible to me. Don't they read this Bible? And if so, how can you ignore this repeating pattern, this repeating statement over and over and over again? And what happens if you don't follow these things? The rebellion, the destruction, over and over and over again. These expectations from God are eternal. He hasn't, nor will he change just because society thinks it's okay to marry someone of the same sex, kill your babies, or curse God to his face.
Wow.
Just because society says it's okay and you can do it, God hasn't changed. These rules still apply, and they are still in effect today. These issues today that we're experiencing in the daily news are just merely shadows of a persistent problem with humanity. We degenerate by laziness. If we make no effort to stay on course, we get off pitch. We sin. Didn't you say, and when you're singing, you have to hold a note? What do you have to do? You have to constantly refresh the note.
Renew the vowel.
Why? What happens if you don't?
You go flat.
Why?
It's
we're constructed that way. To maintain a pitch, if you're holding a note, you have to constantly renew it. If you're going to have a relationship with God, you have to constantly renew it. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm saved and that's it," because what's going to happen? You're going to get off pitch. You're going to slide. And we see this today. We see this back then. And the result is that we sin. And in order to prevent being judged on our sins, we make them socially acceptable. We make laws so that it's okay. We tell people that you can't chastise someone for doing that sin because who are you to judge? We put God in the position of being unreasonable and ignore him and his consequences. These verses need to be, like I said, these need to be in every courthouse. These need to be in every schoolhouse. This is the one that needs to be known because this is the promise that he has made. This is the contract that he has made with us over and over and over again in this Bible. And I think it's astonishing that we don't do this. Because he doesn't demand a lot. He doesn't demand a lot. But follow my decrees, obey my laws, keep my commands, and obey them. And I'll never leave you. Look at the payoff versus what you have to do.
Yeah.
I mean, does it seem like that? Oh, that's so hard. And is it worth it? Just to have God with me all the time? Is it worth it? Is it worth it, Mom? You were in that traffic issue?
Definitely worth it.
Is it worth it for the house? I mean, everything that we've experienced, I can't imagine anything not being worth having God that will never leave me. This is a small price to pay, and we can't do it as a society. Even in our own churches, actually, we can't do it.
Even we ourselves have problems keeping these things.
Now, let's see, what time is it? Oh, I don't have time for this, but I do want to sum up with the completion of this. This is a 7-year project, a whole bunch of construction jargon here, and I'm going to go through it as quickly as I can. Remember I said he put cedar in the ceiling? He floors the temple with planks of juniper. All this quarrying that he has, he puts woodworking on all the walls. So it's a sort of a soundproof. It's going to be a quiet thing. There's no little echoes going on. Not only that, but it's furnished and laden over with gold. So you've got not concrete. You've got the limestone. You've got the wood, and then you've got the gold overlay. So it's a baffling effect. Not only that, but he also carves, and you can see it behind where the Holy of Holies is, behind the curtain that Jesus will rip someday. You notice that on both sides there are these huge cherubim that are facing outward. The cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant are facing each other, where the Holy of Holies is supposed to be in the middle. But as you're approaching it, you've got the cherubim with their wings outstretched, and they're huge. This picture is a good representation of it. The first cherub, one wing was 5 cubits long, and doing the math, that's 7 feet, just the wing. All right, that's a human body, more or less. The second cherub measured 10 cubits, and the 2 cherubim were identical in size and shape. Once again, all this woodworking done off-site. Let's see. They were made out of wood, and then he covered them with gold. On the walls around the temple, both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim. So you see on the walls, there's depictions over there as well. Angels. Remember when we talk about Revelation, we talk about the heavenly host that's surrounding Jesus. There's the cherubim, and they're always chanting these sort of things. The same sort of thing here. It's not necessarily so that you'll worship the cherubim, but to know that the cherubim worship God, and that you need to show the reverence when you walk in there. It's supposed to be an awe-inspiring thing, and you're supposed to have a clean heart. No Gentiles were allowed to transgress into this thing. The Gentiles had to be on the outer skirts, so they could only enter through one gate. They weren't able to come in here. Only Israelites were able to come in here, only clean ones. And then to get into the Holy of Holies itself, you had to be the high priest, and that was it. The doors, he carved cherubim, palm trees, open flowers. Once again, not only just the angels worshiping God, but all of nature. This is another common thing that we learned about. All of nature, the name of Jesus. He also made 2 doors out of juniper wood and having 2 leaves that turned on sockets. He built an inner courtyard, 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams. The foundation of the temple was laid in the 4th year in the month of Ziv, in the 11th year of the month of Bo, the 8th month, blah, blah, blah. I already told you when it happened. And he had spent 7 years building it. I want to point out here as we close that David was feeling bad because he was living in his palace and God was still living in a tent. You notice? He had it all backwards. Solomon built God's house first. It took him 7 years. He then takes the next 13 years to build his palace. So he put God first. Once again, what is the definition of wisdom? What is my definition of wisdom? Putting God first, following what God wants for you. So Solomon, in his wisdom, is putting God first, and then he puts himself second, which God loves that sort of thing. Yeah, that's what wisdom is. I would also suggest that those verses that I kept harping on, that's the definition of wisdom too. You follow his command, his decrees, and follow what he tells you. That's wisdom. Anyway, so it takes him almost twice as long to build his palace than it did to build the temple. And we're going to discuss that construction project next week.
Wow.
It's good.
Now, you mentioned Mount Moriah. You didn't say that the temple was built on the place where